They laughed when he dug a rain pit that pit-watered 90 acres through for dry years the rains quit in Swisher County, Texas, in the spring of 1952. They didn't come back the way anyone expected. Delbert noticed it first in March. The Playa Lake in the northwest corner of his property failed to fill after the last winter storm. The Playa had been holding water every March since he'd started farming this ground in 1934. Not always full, not always deep, but holding. That March it collected maybe 4 inches in the lowest basin and evaporated before the middle of the month. Delbert stood at the edge of it with his boots in the damp mud and looked at the sky to the west. The sky was clear. It had been clear for 11 days. He was 54 years old, had been working this land outside Tulia since before most of his neighbors had arrived in the county. The farm ran 90 acres of dryland cotton and sorghum. It sat along the east side of County Road 15, 3 miles south of the grain elevator. The soil was Pullman clay loam, dark and heavy, good ground when it had moisture and hard as kiln brick when it didn't. Delbert had 2 wells on the property, both shallow, both tapping into the upper portion of the Ogallala Formation at about 60 feet. In wet years, the water table sat 40 feet down, and both pumps ran without complaint. The summer of 1951 had been adequate. The summer before that, better, the wells had kept up. He walked back to the truck and drove home. His wife, Norma, he sat down, ate, and said nothing about the Playa for 3 days. The county agent came through in early April on his spring rotation. His name was Walt Greer. He had been the Swisher County agent for 6 years, transferred from Lamb County before that. He drove a green Chevy pickup and kept a clipboard on the bench seat with a printed schedule of farm. He stopped at Delbert's place on a Thursday morning, walked the east cotton field, made notes about variety selection and planting date. Before he left, Delbert mentioned the Playa. Greer looked at the northwest corner from the edge of the road, said he'd seen a few Playas fail to fill that spring, said it was likely a 1-year aberration, said the Ogallala levels were still adequate for the region, said Delbert's shallow wells would be fine through the season if he managed irrigation timing correctly. He had a pamphlet from Texas A&M about irrigation scheduling, left it on the porch rail. Delbert read the pamphlet that evening, put it in the drawer by the phone. The cotton went in on May 3rd, the sorghum a week later. Both came up. Both looked adequate through June. July brought 1.1 inches of rain in 2 events, each brief, each followed by high heat that pulled the moisture back out of the top inch before it reached root depth. Delbert ran the irrigation pump on the east well for 3 days straight. The water level in the casing dropped 8 feet in 72 hours. He'd never seen it drop that fast. He pulled the pump, measured the standing water depth with a weighted line. 31 feet. Down from 40 the previous October. 9 feet of draw down, and he wrote the number on the back of an envelope and put the envelope in his shirt pocket. The 1952 harvest came in light. Cotton averaged 280 pounds of lint per acre against a county average of 340. The sorghum was worse, 1,800 weight per acre where the county was running 26. Delbert had made lighter harvests before. 1947 had been worse. But 1947 had been one bad year and a run of decent ones. He had a feeling standing at the gin that fall, listening to the other men talk about next season's planting. The feeling was that 1952 was not a 1-year problem. He didn't say this at the gin. He bought his supplies and drove home. That winter, Delbert walked the full 90 acres on foot, section by section, over 3 days in December. The ground was dormant. He could see the shape of the land clearly without the crop in the way. He wasn't looking at soil. He was looking at elevation. The way the land moved. Where water went when it came. Swisher County sits on the southern high plains, the Llano Estacado, and from road level, it looks flat. It isn't flat. It has a grade. Slight, nearly imperceptible, but consistent. Water that fell on his property moved east to northeast. He had known this in a general way for 18 years. That December, he walked it with purpose. He watched the dry soil surface for subtle color changes, the stains that showed where water had tracked during previous rain events. There was a draw. He had always thought of it as nothing, a slight depression in the northeast quarter that collected maybe an acre of low ground. He'd planted through it for years without much attention to it. But walking it in December, looking at the drainage lines in the surrounding 40 acres, he realized the draw sat at the convergence point of 3 separate micro-drainages. Everything that fell on the northeast 40 ran toward that low spot. In a good rain year, water collected there and soaked in over a few days. He stood in the draw for a long time, measured the perimeter with his boots. About 180 feet east to west, 120 feet north to south. He went home and drew it on a piece of graph paper. Walt Greer came back for his winter visit in January of 1953. Delbert showed him the drawing, explained what he was thinking. If he excavated the draw, deepened it, widened it, shaped the inflow channels to direct runoff, it could hold standing water from rain events, not just a playa that evaporated. A pit with enough depth to store volume, something he could pump from when the wells dropped. Greer looked at the drawing, looked at it for a while, said it was an interesting idea, said the soil permeability was a concern, said clay loam would seep faster than Delbert expected, said for serious water storage, you needed a lined pond, and a lined pond ran $800 to $1,200 in materials alone in 1953, not counting excavation. Then he said the word that Delbert heard and didn't respond to. He called it a mud hole. Not meanly, just matter-of-factly, the way you say something when you've already concluded it. He said Delbert would end up with a mud hole in his northeast quarter that would breed mosquitoes in summer and be dry by August regardless. Said the real answer was to drill a new well deeper into the Ogallala, where the water table was more stable. Said a 200-foot well would cost about $1,800, but would give reliable water for 20 years. He left the pamphlet on irrigation costs on the porch rail when he went. Delbert went to the co-op in Tulia the following week for seed and a belt for the tractor. The counterman, a fellow named Arlen Dobbins, who had worked there since 1941, mentioned that Walt Greer had stopped in the day before. Said Greer had told the men there about the Pruitt place digging a mud hole for irrigation water. The men had thought that was something. Delbert bought his seed, bought the belt, drove home. He called a man named Floyd Kessler in February. Kessler ran a small earth-moving operation out of Plainview, a D7 Caterpillar dozer and a pull-type scraper. He'd done some land leveling work in Swisher County over the years. Delbert had hired him in 1948 to level a rough section on the south boundary. He explained what he wanted. Kessler drove out in his truck the last week of February, walked the draw with Delbert, looked at the graph paper drawing, asked a few questions, said he could do it. Said the work would take about 4 days with the D7. Quoted $340 for the excavation, 2 days for digging, 1 day for shape, 1 day for cutting the inflow channels from the surrounding drainage lines. Delbert said when could he start? Kessler said mid-March. The excavation began on March 14, 1953. Kessler brought the D7 on a lowboy flatbed from Plainview, offloaded it at the gate on County Road 15, drove it across the field to the draw. The dozer was a 1949 machine, and it sounded like it when Kessler started it, a deep mechanical knock that Delbert could hear from the house 600 yards away. The first day, Kessler pushed the topsoil off the entire basin area, 180 by 120 feet, and piled it on the north bank. Then, he began cutting down. The draw was sitting at natural grade, roughly 3 feet below the surrounding field. Delbert wanted 9 feet of total depth at the center. That meant cutting 6 more feet out of the clay loam bottom and shaping the walls to a 3-to-1 slope so they wouldn't slow in. The clay loam came out in chunks, dark brown, dense, faintly damp even in the dry winter. Kessler piled the excavated material on the north and west banks, which Delbert planned to keep as berms to direct runoff into the pit rather than away from it. By the end of the second day, the center was down 7 feet. Delbert walked the bottom of the pit with Kessler in the late afternoon when the dozer had gone quiet. The walls were steep and clean. It smelled like upturned earth, cold and mineral, and slightly alkaline. The bottom was 80 feet long by 50 feet wide at that depth. They finished on day 4. The final dimensions, 9 feet deep at center, 180 by 120 feet at the rim. 2 cut channels ran into the upper end, each 18 inches wide and 6 inches deep, connecting from the northeast and northwest drainage lines. The total estimated volume at full capacity, approximately 380,000 gallons. Delbert had worked the arithmetic himself from the pit measurements and a surface area table in a soil water management book. He'd borrowed the book from the county library in Tulia. The total cost, $340 for Kessler's work. Delbert did the channel cutting himself with the Farmall M and a blade attachment he borrowed from his neighbor to the north, Harlan Sipes. Harlan Sipes had watched the excavation from his truck on the county road twice during the 4 days. He didn't stop. He mentioned at the co-op that Delbert Pruitt had paid $340 to have a hole dug in his field. The men at the counter had a comment about that. The pit sat empty through March and into April of 1953. The rains did not come. The pit was a large brown excavation in the clay loam, precise and empty, the cut banks drying to a lighter color in the sun. Norma didn't say anything about the $340. She kept the household accounts in a ledger by the kitchen door. She recorded the expense and didn't revisit it. The first significant rain came on April 28th. 1 inch and 4/100, measured on Delbert's rain gauge, which hung on the north wall of the barn where it had hung since 1946. It fell in about 90 minutes starting at 2 in the afternoon. Hard enough to see the drainage lines running before the rain stopped. Delbert went out the next morning and walked to the pit. It had collected. Not full. Not close to full. The water stood at about 14 inches in the center of the basin, dark brown from the suspended clay, covering maybe a third of the bottom. He pushed his boot heel into the wet bank and watched the way it held. The clay loam was sealing against itself as it saturated the natural plasticity of the soil, exactly what he'd been counting on. He went back to the house and told Norma there was water in the pit. 2 more rain events came through May and early June, totaling 2.3 additional inches. By the middle of June 1953, the pit held approximately 4 feet of water across. Delbert measured the depth with a graduated wooden rod he'd cut and marked in 6-inch increments, 4 feet of water across 180 by 120 feet. He did the arithmetic on the back of an envelope, roughly 64,800 cubic feet. About 485,000 gallons. He hadn't needed the wells all spring. The summer of 1953 was dry. July brought 0.4 inches. August brought 0.6. The cotton needed water in late July. Delbert ran a 2-inch suction hose from the pit to a centrifugal pump he'd bought used at a farm sale in Lockney. A Gorman Rupp unit, 1947, that he'd paid $55 for. He pumped from the pit for 4 days. The water level in the pit dropped 8 inches. The cotton got what it needed. He ran the well 0 hours that July. Harlan Sipes came over in August, said he'd been meaning to return the blade attachment. Stood at the edge of the pit for about 10 minutes looking at the water level. The pit was down about 16 inches from its June peak, still holding well over 300,000 gallons. Harlan didn't say anything specific. He returned the blade, drove home. The 1953 harvest was better than 1952, but still below average. The rain deficit was real, and the pit couldn't replace adequate rainfall across the full field. But Delbert's cotton came in at 310 pounds of lint per acre. The county average was 290. He'd beat it. On a drought year. Without running his wells past early June. Walt Greer came for his fall visit in October. Walked the field with Delbert. Asked about the irrigation season. Delbert showed him the pump log, a small spiral notebook where he'd recorded every pumping event, date, hours, estimated gallons moved. The pit had supplied 90% of his summer irrigation water. The east well had contributed the remainder in 2 short sessions. Greer looked at the pump log, made notes on his clipboard, looked at the pit. The water was down to about 2 feet in the center, dark and still, with a faint skin of algae on the surface edges. He didn't use the word mudhole. The winter of 1953 into 1954 brought some recharge. 3 moderate snow events in January and February, each melting slowly into the drainage lines carried the melt into the pit. By March 1954, the water stood at 3 feet 4 inches, not the June high water from the previous year, but substantial. The spring of 1954 brought 1.8 inches total through May, below average. The lowest spring rainfall in Swisher County since 1947. The other farms in the area began to feel. Harlan Sipes drilled an additional 40 feet on his primary well in May 1954. Cost him $310. The water table had dropped. His shallow pump had been pulling air. The deeper perforation helped, but the flow rate was reduced. He was drawing less water in more time. The Vickers place to the south, Carl Vickers, who ran 110 acres of dryland cotton, pulled his west pump entirely that summer. The casing had gone dry. He brought a drilling crew out in July. New well, 220 feet. Cost $1,900. He borrowed against the next year's crop to do it. Delbert irrigated from the pit all summer. He ran the Gorman-Rupp pump every 3 to 4 days on the cotton during the critical bowl set period in July and August. The water level in the pit dropped steadily 2 inches per major, more or less, depending on duration. He tracked every measurement in the spiral notebook. By September 1954, the pit was down to 14 inches in the center. Low, the lowest it had been since it was dug. He had pushed it hard. But the cotton had made it through bowl set and was setting bowls on schedule. The harvest came in at 330 pounds of lint per acre. County average, 261. He wrote both numbers in the spiral notebook, drew a line under them. The drought deepened in 1955. Swisher County received 8.4 inches of precipitation that year. The annual average was 18.3 inches. The playas across the county failed to fill. The water table in the Ogallala dropped an estimated 2 to 3 feet across the region. According to a Texas Water Development Board report that the county agent circulated in the fall. Delbert's pit received 4.1 inches of inflow equivalent during the spring rain event's rain that fell on the surrounding 40 acres and drained toward the basin. The difference between open-air rainfall and what he collected in the pit was the contributing watershed. Every drop that fell on those 40 acres eventually reached his basin. 40 acres of collection for a 3/4 acre pit. The pit peaked at 2 feet 8 inches in June 1955. He irrigated all summer. Ran the Gorman-Rupp constantly through the worst of July. didn't touch either well until August, when he ran the east pump for 6 days on the South Cotton as a supplement. The 1955 harvest, 290 pounds per acre. County average, 198. Walt Greer drove out in September without scheduling it in advance. He brought a colleague from the Texas A&M Extension Service in Lubbock, a man named Dr. Howard Ellard, who worked in soil and water conservation. Ellard walked the pit with Delbert for 2 hours. He had a transit level and a measuring rod, and he shot elevations along the inflow channels and around the basin rim. He measured the contributing watershed area. He reviewed the spiral notebook, all 3 years of pump logs and water level measurements. He asked Delbert, who had designed the inflow channel system. Delbert told him he had, with a graph paper drawing, and what he'd learned from watching the field drain in wet years. Ellard wrote in his notebook for a while. Then he told Delbert the channel configuration was nearly optimal for the contributing area and soil type. Said the 3-to-1 bank slope had held without significant sloughing, which was better than many engineered ponds he'd evaluated. Said the natural clay loam ceiling had reduced percolation losses to an estimated 8 to 12% annually lower than most unlined structures. Greer didn't say anything during this. He stood at the pit rim and took notes. Ellard drove back to Lubbock. 3 months later, Delbert received a copy of a preliminary extension bulletin on farm water harvesting in dryland regions. His pit was described in a case study section. It referred to him as a Swisher County producer. His name wasn't in it. He read the case study carefully. The engineering language was different from anything he'd have used. The numbers were his. The 1956 season was the worst of the 4. Total precipitation, 7.9 inches. The Ogallala water table in northern Swisher County dropped an additional 3 feet. Carl Vickers drilled a 3rd well, and Harlan Sipes traded a piece of equipment to share drill time with a neighbor because he couldn't afford another well alone. Delbert's pit had gone into the winter at 11 inches. The snow events of January and February 1956, 3 of them, moderate recharged it to 2 feet 1 inch by March. The spring rains added another 10 inches of water depth by late May. He irrigated all summer. Cotton only he had shifted away from sorghum in 1954 to concentrate his water on the higher value crop. He ran the Gorman Rupp 4 days out of every 7 during bowl set. Water level at the end of August, 9 inches. He had pushed it to the edge. He ran the east well for the final 2 weeks of the irrigation season to get the cotton through. The 1956 harvest, 270 pounds per acre, county average, 163. He wrote both numbers in the notebook. Turn the page. Walt Greer came out in November with Harlan Sipes and Carl Vickers. Greer had arranged it. He didn't explain why in advance. They walked the pit, all 4 of them, on a gray November morning with a wind coming out of the northwest at about 20 miles an hour. The pit had maybe 6 inches in the center by then. The banks were solid. The clay loam had cured hard on the interior walls. Greer asked Delbert to walk through the construction dimensions. Cost, the channel system, the pump setup. Delbert did. He brought the spiral notebook. Went through every year, every pump event, every water level measurement. Harlan Sipes asked one question about the channel dimensions. Carl Vickers stood with his hands in his coat pockets and listened. Vickers had paid $1,900 for the deep well in 1954, another $600 for the 3rd well in 1956. His water costs for the 4-year drought period, $2,500 in drilling alone. Delbert had spent $340 for the excavation and $55 for the used pump. Total, $395. Nobody said anything about the arithmetic. They all knew the arithmetic. Greer drove back to his office in Tulia. He filed a report with the Texas A&M Extension Service on the Pruitt Pit as a demonstration case for dry land water harvesting. The report ran 14 pages. He sent Delbert a copy in January 1950. The cover letter said the commission was considering a cost-share program for similar structures in dryland counties. He did not mention the word mudhole in the letter or in the report. Harlan Sipes came over in March of 1957. The rains had started up again. 1957 would turn out to be an above-average year. The drought breaking in most of... He told Delbert he was thinking about the low spot on the south end of his property, where runoff collected after heavy rain. Asked how deep Delbert had gone. Asked about the bank slope. Asked where Kessler's number was, the earth mover out of Plainview. Delbert gave him Kessler's number. Kessler dug Harlan's pit that April. Delbert farmed the same 90 acres until 1974. The pit held water through every dry stretch that followed. 1963 was a difficult year. 1971 was worse. Both times, the pit carried him through without emergency well drilling. He ran the Gorman-Rupp pump until the motors seized in 1968. Replaced it with a newer centrifugal unit from a dealer in Plainview. Same principle. He retired in 1974. Sold the property to a young couple from Canyon who wanted to farm cotton. He spent 2 afternoons walking the farm with them before the closing. The second afternoon, he took them to the pit. It held about 3 feet of water that October. The banks had settled and weathered into the surrounding field over 21 years. Green algae lined the interior. A pair of mallards had taken up on the surface that fall, which had not happened before, and which Delbert considered neither significant nor insignificant. He showed them the spiral notebooks, all 6 of them, going back to 1953. Pump logs, water levels, rain gauge readings, yield numbers. He told them about the inflow channels where they ran, how to maintain them, how to clear the silt that collected at the intake every 3 or 4 years. They asked what the pit had cost to build. He told them $395. One of them asked why he'd done it the way he had, before the drought came. Delbert looked at the pit, said he'd watched the playa fail to fill in March of 1952 and had not liked what he sold them the Gorman-Rupp replacement pump with the property. The pit is still there, still in that same northeast quarter, 180 feet east to west, 120 feet north to south at the rim. The current owner, who is the 3rd since Delbert, uses it to water a cattle operation now. The cotton is gone from the farm. The inflow channels are still cut and still functional. Different crop, same water, different decade, same pit. What Delbert dug in March of 1953 for $340 is still holding water. It rained last week in Swisher County. The drainage lines ran. The pit filled.